this leads me on to, I guess, my first question. And listen, the way I'm going to do this, just so the audience knows, is I'm going to come to each of you with a question. But by all means, if anybody wants to sort of chip in and say their experience or their thoughts, feel free. But I'm going to come first of all to you, Ewan. A lot of the interest that I got in terms of audience participation in this panel was around, I guess, just best practice strategies. So you can use Aegon as an example if you want, but just from your experience as a TA leader, what would you say some of the key strategies or best practices are that organisations can use to make sure they stay ahead of recruitment trends and make sure that they are the most competitive to secure that top talent? Because at the end of the day, as hiring managers, that's what organisations want. They want to get the best. So how do we do that? How do we make sure we're on top of everybody else?
Yeah, it's a great question. And following on from Gordon's point, which I think is such an astute one in terms of we can get quite confused quite easily. And then Carolyn, you touched on the fact that there's so many bolt-ons, there's so much out there. I think when we talk about trends and strategies, I think we need to be quite disciplined and not just picking up the next shiny thing.
Yeah.
We need to be quite disciplined and intentional with actually what is our strategy, and then that real discipline and intention to make sure that it is blended. So actually, what's the problem we're trying to solve? So that consideration piece. I don't think we can consider bolting on really, innovative employer brand work or AI or any additional tech unless you've got the basics really right. So the basics need to be down. The strong foundations can be then built on. Again, as TA professionals, I think we need to operate within our parameters. We're talking about tech here. Tech has its restraints. Tasha talked about that. There's good and bad, right? And we need to operate within those constraints and be really okay with that and get the most out of the tech that is there before we add to that digital estate and make it even more confused than it sometimes might already be. So I think understanding where you are in that journey, what is the problem you're trying to solve, and being very pragmatic. I think Katie, linkage back for me to like what is the people strategy? What are we trying to solve as a function, as a wider business, and get really the balance right between aspiration and audacious goals and living within reality and those constraints. A big thing for me in terms of mindset is just controlling what you can control. So there's a lot out there. Get really focused on what you can control and make sure there's real value add. But fundamentally, I think if we get these basics down, and for me, some of that is just really good candidate experience. And what do we mean by that? Being clear on that. And I think when you get the basics down, you can scale up. You can be agile. It can be then sustainable. But without the strong foundations, your proposition is null and void, and you can't bolt on everything else unless you get the basics done right. So I think for me, there's lots of trends out there. But to remain competitive, I think you do the basics incredibly well and bolt on what's required to solve your particular TA problem.
I'm seeing lots of nods here, so I think there's a lot of stuff there that you're saying that's resonating. I mean, just to open up to the rest of the panel, is there anything else you would want to add into what Ewan's already said very well? I hasten to add, it's there's a lot there that I think, bang on, Ewan, what you're saying.
I think that in terms of what Ewan was saying is that the issue that we're having is that there are so many variables that if you're not taking the time to build that foundation, those variables can just get out of control and it will become detrimental rather than being a positive experience for the candidates that you're trying to attract, and obviously the recruitment process that you're trying to streamline.
Totally. Funnily enough, that leads me on quite nicely, Tasha, to a question I wanted to direct for you. Because I had a lot of questions around this aspect, and it was around, I guess, what companies are doing to make their practices more inclusive for specifically neurodiverse candidates, apart from the usual, which everybody should be doing anyway, about asking for a declaration of any disabilities. Are there any reasonable adjustments we can make? So from your observations of talent processes and recruitment processes, whatever you want to call them, what are companies doing to make them more inclusive?
Yeah, I think that it's a huge subject at the moment for talent acquisition in the recruitment space. And purely the biggest positive that we're seeing is organizations that are open to education. And that starts with language, understanding the difference between neurodiversity and neurodivergence, understanding that, you know, each individual, their personal profile traits are as unique to them as their fingerprints. Not one neurodivergent person has the same profile traits as somebody else. And I think that, you know, that feels massive to organizations when they're trying to navigate that. But what we are trying to foster is open communication. And the way that we can put that in place is you're seeing companies that are doing the guaranteed interview scheme.
Yep.
And what we'll find is that a lot of neurodivergent individuals don't actually class themselves with a disability. And that closes that off to support and being open to have reasonable adjustments. So it's looking at that process and saying, okay, we know that some neurodivergent candidates don't consider them disabled or have a disability need, but is there a capability question that we need to be covering in terms of, okay, you don't class yourself with a disability, however, can we support you in a capability barrier? And, you know, there's lots of things that we can do in terms of signposting to access to work. You know, there's options for ADHD coaches. There are, you know, support systems for going over your CV, doing role play. And I think it's just making sure that your processes are clear in terms of your inclusivity statement, and not being afraid to ask those questions, and having transparent communication that means that neurodivergent candidates are not afraid to approach you, because we have very curious minds. And if you're open for discussion, we'll have it, we'll be there, and we will help you build a process that may be more inclusive for neurodivergent candidates.
Great. Anything anybody wants to add on that?
Yeah, Katie, if I don't mind, I'd love to pick Tasha's brain a little bit more on that, Tasha, because it's something, you know, certainly I'm really curious about. And I love the point you make about not just about asking disability, but capability. A really hot topic that I've heard a lot recently companies are doing is sending interview questions in advance. How do you feel about that? Because I've seen different people that are neurodivergent or neurodiverse have different takes on that. I'd love to get your view on what you feel about that, if that's okay.
I think that, as we discussed with the different profile traits, it's not so much as having a blanket approach other than having options. So you can have a application option system, and it doesn't need to be complicated. It could be things like you have an application form, don't have it death by PowerPoint, 10 pages long. You can ask if you need assistance. You know, lots of people think that neurodivergency is purely autism, ADHD. No, it's dyslexia, it's dyspraxia. So therefore, having something in bigger print, having someone to support you, to talk you through the application, doing interview applications where you talk someone through that, or sending questions on a simpler basis, I think are really positive. And if someone asks to be able to have the option for the interview questions, have that on your application. Do you need interview questions prior to your interview? It's just opening up these conversations to find out what works best for neurodivergent candidates.
Great, I love that. Actually, that's a really good point, Tasha, and thanks for that question, Gordon.
Katie, can I just come in on the, and
of
this is this is just a statement and we can move on pretty quick, right?
Yeah.
I wonder about interviews more holistically, and I don't want to go down a rabbit warren, and I really don't. But when you unpack what an interview is, it's quite false, right, in terms of its setup. So would you ever go to a meeting for 2 hours with 3 people that you've never met before without an agenda? So I think we should do more in terms of giving people questions and setting people up to succeed. Would I accept a meeting for 2 hours with 3 people?
Not blind date.
Probably not exactly that. Not a blind date.
That's a whole other trend.
So there's a whole that's another episode in itself, right? But I think businesses, I think the world of work count, we should strive to do more here, regardless, just to set people up to succeed. An interview is a false state. It's very unsettling. So let's just take some of the stigma out of that and just let people go and have really informed conversations that are two-way. Yes, they need to be scored, it needs to be evidential. I understand all that, but it has to be two-way, because we as an organization won't be right for some people either, and that's okay. So
And
just
that's okay, exactly.
balance and
It's okay.
transparency, I think,
Yeah,
are paramount for me.
100%.